The story begins not with a king, but with a boy, born in a land of mountains, myths, and ambition. The year was 356 BCE. In the ancient kingdom of Macedon, under the watchful gaze of Mount Olympus, a child cried for the first time. His name was Alexander. To some, he was merely a prince, the son of King Philip II and Queen Olympias. But to others, especially his mother, he was destined for greatness far beyond mortal men. Olympias was no ordinary queen. Fierce, mystical, and devoted to the gods, she whispered into Alexander's ear from the moment he could listen that he was no common child. He was the son of Zeus himself. She filled his imagination with tales of heroes and gods, of Achilles and Hercules, of warriors whose names would echo through eternity. And deep within that young boy's heart, those stories took root. Even as a child, Alexander believed he was meant to be more than human. He was meant to be legend. His father, King Philip II, was a man of vision and fire, a warrior king who transformed Macedon from a struggling frontier into a formidable empire. He was both a teacher and a shadow in Alexander's life, a figure of admiration and rivalry. Philip trained his son in the art of leadership, the discipline of war, and the politics of power. But behind every lesson, there was an unspoken tension. Alexander wanted to surpass him. He didn't just want to rule, he wanted to conquer. When Alexander was 13, Philip sought the best education possible for his son. He summoned one of Greece's greatest minds, Aristotle. The philosopher arrived at Mieza, a quiet sanctuary surrounded by trees and marble statues, to mold the young prince's mind. Under Aristotle's guidance, Alexander's world expanded beyond swords and horses. He learned philosophy, ethics, medicine, science, and poetry. He studied the works of Homer with a passion that bordered on obsession. The Iliad became his Bible, and Achilles, his spiritual twin. Aristotle taught him that reason was the light that guided mankind. But Alexander, even as he absorbed those lessons, felt that emotion, courage, passion, and destiny were the forces that truly shaped the world. In that balance between logic and legend, the future conqueror was born. Years passed, and as Alexander grew, so did his legend. He tamed a wild horse that no man dared to ride, a powerful black stallion named Bucephalus. The creature bucked and screamed as stable hands tried and failed to control it. The court laughed when the young prince stepped forward, but Alexander noticed something no one else did. The horse was terrified of its own shadow. Gently, he turned Bucephalus toward the sun so the shadow fell behind, and in moments, the beast calmed. He mounted and rode away, leaving the crowd in stunned silence. King Philip, proud yet shaken, said to him, "My son, seek a kingdom greater than Macedon, for that is all you deserve." That moment defined Alexander. He was no longer just a prince, he was a force of will, and deep down, he knew his destiny was calling. By the time Alexander reached his late teens, Macedon was a rising power under Philip's command. The Greek city-states, long divided by pride and war, were now being drawn under Macedonian influence. Philip had a dream: to unite Greece and march east against the mighty Persian Empire. But as Philip built alliances and armies, his son watched, learned, and waited. Then, fate struck. At a grand celebration in 336 BCE, King Philip II entered a theater surrounded by nobles and guards. As he walked toward the stage, a single assassin stepped forward, Pausanias, one of his own bodyguards, and drove a dagger into the king's chest. The crowd erupted in chaos. The great king of Macedon was dead. His empire, his dream, trembled on the edge of collapse. In that moment of blood and betrayal, the young prince became a king. At just 20 years old, Alexander stood before the people of Macedon, the crown heavy upon his head and the weight of an empire on his shoulders. Many doubted him. He was young, untested, and impulsive. Rivals whispered that he would fall within months, but they underestimated his fire. Within days, Alexander acted with brutal precision, crushing rebellions, securing loyalties, and eliminating threats to his throne. His rise was as swift as it was ruthless. In the months that followed, he turned his gaze toward Greece. The city-states wavered, unsure whether to follow him as they had his father. When Thebes dared to rebel, Alexander marched his army south with lightning speed. The Thebans expected hesitation. Instead, they faced fury. In a single day, the city was destroyed, its walls torn down, and its people scattered or sold into slavery. It was a message written in fire. Defy Alexander, and you defy destiny itself. The Greek world trembled, and then bowed. One by one, the city-states joined him, not out of love, but out of fear and awe. Alexander was now not only king of Macedon, but commander of all Greece. And as he stood before his assembled armies, his eyes turned east, toward the horizon, toward the lands of Persia, and toward a dream his father once had, the conquest of the greatest empire the world had ever known. But Alexander's ambition burned even brighter. For him, Persia was only the beginning. He told his men, "There are worlds beyond worlds to conquer." Those words became his creed. To him, life was not about peace or comfort. It was about glory, to carve one's name into the fabric of history. That was the only immortality worth chasing. Yet, behind that fierce determination, there was still the boy who grew up listening to tales of heroes, the boy who believed he was chosen by the gods, the boy who wanted, above all, to be remembered. And so began his march toward eternity, a journey that would change the world forever. As Alexander prepared to cross into Asia, he stood on the shores of the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Europe from Asia. Before stepping onto Persian soil, he threw a spear into the ground and declared, "I accept this land as a gift from the gods." To his men, it was a gesture of divine confidence. To Alexander, it was destiny claiming its first piece of the world. At his side rode Bucephalus, his loyal companion, and behind him marched tens of thousands of soldiers, Greeks, Macedonians, and allies united under his banner. The wind carried the sound of their armor and the beat of their boots across the fields. They were an army unlike any other, disciplined, fearless, and led by a man who would soon be known as Alexander the Great. But no one, not even Alexander himself, could have imagined what awaited across that water: the triumphs, the tragedies, and the transformation of a man who would become a god in the eyes of history. The legend had begun. The sun rose over Pella, the Macedonian capital, painting the palace walls in gold. The scent of smoke still lingered from the torches that burned during Philip's funeral. For days, the city had mourned, and now it held its breath. In the grand hall where kings had been crowned for generations, a young man stood tall, his eyes sharp and steady. The weight of the world rested on his shoulders. Alexander, barely 20, was about to inherit not just a throne, but an empire trembling with uncertainty. Every step he took echoed through marble corridors filled with whispers. Some nobles bowed with forced smiles, others turned away, uncertain if this boy could rule. They remembered Philip's power, his authority, his victories. Alexander was not his father, but in the fire of his youth burned something far greater, a relentless will, an unshakable confidence that would soon silence every doubt. He stood before his people, his voice strong yet calm. "My father is gone," he declared, "but his dream lives in me. Greece will not fall apart. It will rise higher than ever before." The crowd erupted in cheers, but Alexander knew that loyalty built on words was fragile. He needed to act, swiftly, decisively. In the months that followed, Alexander moved like a storm. Rebellions flared across the kingdom, fueled by ambitious nobles and distant tribes who saw Philip's death as a chance to break free. But Alexander struck each one down with precision. He rode at the front of his army, fearless and unyielding. To his men, he wasn't just a king, he was a warrior, one of them. His first test came in Thrace, where barbarian tribes defied Macedon's rule. The terrain was brutal, steep mountains, narrow passes, and constant ambushes. Yet Alexander, with his unmatched sense of strategy, turned every challenge into victory. He led his troops through mountain trails no army had dared cross before, outflanking his enemies and crushing them with speed and cunning. His tactics became legend, unpredictable, ruthless, brilliant. Word spread across Greece like wildfire. The boy king was not weak, he was dangerous, but rebellion still smoldered in Thebes. Proud, defiant Thebes, the heart of Greek resistance. When news reached Alexander that the city had risen against him, many expected him to hesitate. Thebes was strong, its warriors seasoned. Yet Alexander didn't flinch. He gathered his army and marched south, 200 miles in less than 2 weeks. The speed was so shocking that when Theban scouts saw Macedonian banners on the horizon, they thought it was a trick. It wasn't. Thebes fell in one brutal day. Its walls were torn down, its people scattered, and the ashes of its rebellion blown to the wind. The destruction was merciless, but Alexander's message was clear. Defiance would not be tolerated. The rest of Greece bowed without question. Even Athens, once the proud jewel of Greek civilization, submitted. For the first time in history, the Greek world was united under one ruler, a single banner, and that banner bore the name of Alexander. But unity was not his ultimate goal. Alexander's gaze turned east, toward the vast and glittering Persian Empire, a land of unimaginable wealth and power. For centuries, Persia had been the shadow looming over Greece. Its kings had sent armies across the Aegean, burned cities, and demanded tribute. Even though Greece had repelled them in wars long past, the memory of Persian arrogance still stung. To Alexander, Persia wasn't just an enemy. It was destiny. He saw himself as the avenger of Greece, the heir to the warriors who once fought at Marathon and Thermopylae. Yet his ambition went beyond vengeance. He didn't just want to conquer Persia. He wanted to surpass every conqueror who had ever lived. He wanted to unite East and West under one crown. Before he could march east, Alexander secured his rear. He strengthened his alliances, replenished his army, and surrounded himself with loyal companions. Among them was Hephaestion, his closest friend and confidant, the one man who understood him not as a king, but as a person. Their bond was deep, a friendship forged in trust and shared dreams. When Alexander spoke of destiny, Hephaestion listened not as a soldier, but as a believer. By the spring of 334 BCE, the preparations were complete. Alexander's army was unlike any other in the known world, 40,000 strong, disciplined, and fierce, a perfect blend of Macedonian phalanxes, Greek hoplites, archers, and cavalry. He had the loyalty of men who would follow him to the ends of the earth, and soon they would. Before crossing the Hellespont into Asia, Alexander visited the tomb of Achilles. He laid a wreath upon it and whispered a prayer. "Bless me, great hero," he said softly, "and grant me your strength and glory." He saw himself as the new Achilles, destined to carve his name into eternity. Then, in a symbolic act, he took his spear and hurled it into the soil of Asia, claiming the land as his own. "From this moment," he declared, "Asia belongs to us." When his army landed on Persian shores, they were greeted not with resistance, but with silence, the calm before a storm that would shake the world. The first major test came at the Battle of the Granicus River. On the opposite bank stood the Persian satraps, their armies glittering with gold and arrogance. They believed the young Macedonian would fall quickly. But they were wrong. As Alexander led his men into battle, he didn't wait for the enemy to come to him. He charged across the river first, defying convention and fear. The water rose to his chest, arrows hissed through the air, and yet he pressed forward. His men followed, inspired by his courage. The battle was fierce, chaotic and deadly, but in the end, the Persian line broke. Alexander personally cut down several noble commanders, his sword flashing in the sun. By the day's end, the river ran red, and the Persians fled. It was his first victory against the Empire of Persia, a symbol of what was to come. Across the known world, his name began to spread like wildfire. "Alexander," they whispered, "the young lion who defied the East." But the victories were just beginning. With every city he conquered, Alexander faced a choice: destroy or rule. Unlike most conquerors, he often chose mercy. He reinstated local leaders, respected customs, and spared civilians. This approach was both strategic and philosophical. He wanted to be seen not as an invader, but as a liberator, a man destined to unite rather than divide. In Sardis, the Persian capital of Asia Minor, the city surrendered without resistance. Alexander entered with dignity, offering freedom and respect. "You are not conquered," he told the people. "You are free." The words spread faster than his armies. Even those who had never seen him began to believe the rumors that perhaps this Macedonian king was more than human. By the time Alexander reached the city of Gordium, he was already a legend. It was there he faced one of history's most famous challenges, the Gordian knot. The knot, tied by an ancient king, was said to be impossible to untangle. Prophecy claimed that whoever solved it would rule all of Asia. Crowds gathered as Alexander examined the knot, a massive tangle of cords with no visible beginning or end. Some expected him to give up. Others waited for a miracle. Then, without hesitation, Alexander drew his sword and sliced through it with a single stroke. "It doesn't matter how," he said with a grin, "only that it is done." It was a bold act, part defiance, part symbolism. In that moment, Alexander showed the world that he would not be bound by limits or tradition. He would carve his own path, by any means necessary. And so, the young king, who had once been doubted by his own people, was now marching across Asia, unstoppable and fearless. The dream of his father was no longer a dream. It was becoming reality. Yet, as his power grew, so too did his belief in his own destiny. The boy who once sought to prove himself to his father was now chasing something far greater: immortality. The world was beginning to realize Alexander wasn't just building an empire, he was rewriting history itself. The winds of Asia carried whispers of the young king who had crossed the Hellespont with fire in his eyes and destiny in his heart. Word of Alexander Gash's victories reached every corner of the Persian Empire, from the markets of Babylon to the golden halls of Susa. The great King Darius III, ruler of Persia, could no longer ignore this rising storm from the west. The Greeks had come before, but none like this. None had ever dared to dream so large. Alexander's triumph at the Granicus River was only the beginning. His army, hardened by victory, pushed deeper into Asia Minor, moving like a wave that could not be stopped. They marched through mountains, deserts, and rivers, guided by a man whose ambition burned brighter than the sun. To his soldiers, Alexander was not merely a leader. He was a symbol, the living embodiment of courage. Every morning before battle, he would walk among his men. No armor of gold, no throne carried on shoulders, only his shining bronze breastplate and a look of fierce determination. "We fight not for silver or slaves," he told them, "but for glory, for a name that will echo forever." His words were simple, but they lit fires in the hearts of his warriors. The next great challenge awaited in the plains near the city of Issus, where Darius himself would meet Alexander for the first time. The Persian army was vast, hundreds of thousands of men stretching as far as the eye could see. Darius's banners shimmered in the desert sun, his chariots bristling with blades, his soldiers confident that the young Macedonian would be crushed. But Alexander had no fear. He knew the Persians outnumbered him, Yet he trusted in his strategy, his discipline, and the unbreakable will of his men. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Alexander stood on a ridge, gazing at the sea of torches flickering across the Persian camp. He turned to his generals and said quietly, "They have the numbers. We have destiny." The morning of the Battle of Issus dawned cold and gray. The Persians advanced, their chariots cutting through the earth like thunder. But Alexander's army held firm, their spears forming a wall of steel. At the perfect moment, Alexander led his cavalry straight toward Darius himself, cutting through the chaos like a blade through silk. Darius, stunned by the young king's audacity, fled the battlefield in his royal chariot. Panic spread among the Persians. What had begun as a sure victory turned into a rout. The Macedonians pursued relentlessly, capturing Darius's family, his wife, his mother, and his children. When the captives were brought before Alexander, his soldiers expected him to boast or punish them. Instead, he bowed respectfully and said, "Do not fear. You are under the protection of Alexander, not his enemy." He treated them with dignity, even allowing them to keep their royal titles. It was not just mercy, it was strategy. Alexander wanted the world to see that he was not a barbarian conqueror, but a ruler worthy of kingship. The victory at Issus shook the world. The boy from Macedon had humiliated the king of Persia himself. Across Greece and Asia, his name became legend. Poets sang of him as a living god, a second Achilles, the one chosen to unite the earth. But Alexander's journey had only just begun. From Issus, he turned south, toward the great coastal cities of Phoenicia and Egypt. Each step forward brought new challenges, new battles, and new transformations within the young conqueror's heart. His next test was Tyre, a fortress city built on an island, surrounded by walls that rose high above the sea. The Tyrians mocked him from their towers, certain that no army could breach their island. But Alexander refused to be denied. "If the sea stands between us and victory," he said, "then we shall build a road through the waves." And he did. For 7 long months, his army toiled under the blazing sun, building a massive causeway, a bridge of stone and timber, stretching from the mainland to Tyre's island fortress. The Tyrians fought back fiercely, sending fire ships to destroy the bridge, hurling arrows and rocks upon the workers. But Alexander would not stop. When the causeway was finally complete, his men launched a full assault. Siege towers rolled forward, catapults thundered, and Alexander himself led the charge at the front lines. When Tyre fell, it was not just a victory of arms. It was a triumph of sheer will. The impossible had been done. From Tyre, Alexander marched into Egypt, where he was received not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. The Egyptians had long suffered under Persian rule, and when Alexander arrived, they welcomed him as a savior. Priests crowned him pharaoh, declaring him the son of the god Amun. It was here, in the desert sands, that the legend of Alexander the Divine began to take shape. He traveled to the oracle of Siwa, deep in the western desert, where he sought answers from the priests of Amun. The journey was grueling. Endless dunes, scorching heat, and shifting winds that buried men and camels alike. Yet Alexander pressed on, driven by something beyond conquest, a hunger for purpose, for proof that his destiny was divine. When he finally reached the sacred temple, the priests greeted him with reverence. No one knows exactly what was said within those silent halls, but when Alexander emerged, his expression had changed. His men asked what the oracle had told him. He simply replied, "I am the son of Zeus Ammon." From that moment forward, Alexander no longer saw himself as merely human. He began to believe truly and deeply that he was chosen by the gods to rule the world. When he left Egypt, he left behind not only temples and cities, but a new vision of himself. On the banks of the Nile, he founded Alexandria, the city that would bear his name for eternity. It would become a beacon of knowledge, culture, and power, a living monument to his dream of unity between East and West. But destiny called him once more to battle. Darius was gathering his forces again, this time greater than ever before. The Persian king would not run again. He assembled hundreds of thousands of soldiers from across his empire, from India to Babylon, from Egypt to the Black Sea. His army was vast, glittering, and seemingly unstoppable. The stage was set for one of the greatest battles in history, the Battle of Gaugamela. On a moonlit plain near the Tigris River, the two greatest armies of the ancient world faced each other. Darius's forces stretched for miles, war elephants, scythed chariots, cavalry, and endless ranks of infantry. Alexander's army was smaller, but disciplined and united. Before the battle, Alexander knelt in silence, praying to the gods. Then he rose and said to his men, "The fate of the world will be decided today." The clash was thunderous. Persian chariots raced forward, their blades spinning, cutting through the dust. Alexander ordered his men to open their ranks. The chariots flew harmlessly through gaps and were quickly surrounded and destroyed. Then, with perfect timing, Alexander saw the opening he had been waiting for. He led his elite cavalry, the companion horsemen, straight at Darius's center. It was a move of genius. His line curved like a crescent, drawing the Persians outward before striking the heart. The dust rose high, the air filled with screams and steel. Once again, Alexander charged directly toward Darius, and once again, the Persian king fled. The Persian army collapsed. The great king was no more, his empire shattered. The world that had once bowed to Persia now belonged to a single man. Alexander entered Babylon in triumph. The people cheered as he rode through its golden gates, not as a destroyer, but as a ruler. He restored temples, spared lives, and respected traditions. Wherever he went, he blended cultures, merging Greek and Eastern customs into something new, something grander than either. But victory brought change. The young conqueror who once fought for glory began to crave divinity. The boy who once looked up to Achilles now saw himself as greater than Achilles, as a god among men. In the quiet of his chambers, he gazed upon the stars and whispered, "There are no more worlds to conquer, only eternity." He had crossed deserts and rivers, mountains and empires. He had done the impossible. Yet within him a storm was beginning to brew, a conflict not of nations, but of the soul. The march toward glory had brought him to the edge of the world. Now, it would bring him to the edge of himself. The desert wind brushed softly against Alexander's face as he looked eastward. Beyond the horizon lay the unknown, lands spoken of only in whispers, filled with rivers wider than seas, jungles dense as night, and kings who ruled with armies of elephants. To most, this was the edge of the world. But to Alexander, it was only the beginning. His conquests had already reshaped the map, from Greece to Egypt, from the burning palaces of Persepolis to the heart of Asia. Yet something within him stirred restlessly. He had toppled empires, humbled kings, and carved his name into history itself. But he wasn't satisfied. Conquest had become his heartbeat, and peace, his greatest enemy. The year was 331 BCE when Alexander set his eyes upon Egypt. After crushing Darius III's forces at Gaugamela, the road to the west opened before him. When he entered Egypt, he was not a conqueror, but a liberator, greeted as a god sent from the heavens to free them from Persian rule. The people bowed as he entered Memphis. Priests spoke of him as the son of Amun, the god of creation. They placed a crown of gold upon his head, and in that moment, Alexander, once a mortal prince from Macedon, began to see himself as something more. He traveled to the desert of Siwa, a vast ocean of sand and silence. There stood the oracle of Amun, a sacred temple said to reveal the truth of a man's divine nature. The journey there was brutal. Many of his soldiers nearly perished under the blazing sun. But Alexander pressed on, his determination fierce as fire. When he finally arrived, the priests greeted him as, "O son of Zeus Ammon." What the oracle told him in private remains a mystery. But when Alexander emerged, his face was calm, his eyes distant, as if he had spoken to destiny itself. From that day on, he carried himself not merely as a king, but as a god among men. He ordered the construction of a new city at the mouth of the Nile, Alexandria. He envisioned it as a shining beacon of learning, trade, and culture, where East and West could meet and flourish. This dream of fusion, of uniting the world under one rule, one vision, became the soul of his empire. It was no longer just about victory. It was about legacy. When spring returned, Alexander's army marched again. They crossed deserts, mountains, and rivers, chasing the remnants of Darius's power. But fate had already dealt the Persian king a cruel hand. Betrayed by his own men, Darius lay dying when Alexander found him. The Macedonian knelt beside his fallen foe, draped his cloak over him, and whispered a promise: "Your death will be avenged." He wept for Darius, not as an enemy, but as a fellow king, a man crushed beneath the weight of empire. With Persia finally his, Alexander's empire stretched farther than any before him. But his ambition, that insatiable fire, burned brighter still. He dreamed of India, the land beyond the known world. His generals warned him. The soldiers were exhausted, their armor rusted, their hearts weary from years of war. But Alexander refused to listen. "There are worlds yet to conquer," he said, eyes shining with madness and wonder. The march into India tested every ounce of their strength. Monsoons drenched the troops for weeks. The jungles swarmed with snakes and insects, and the unfamiliar heat turned metal to fire. Yet Alexander led from the front, drenched, tired, and scarred, but unbroken. He refused comfort. If his men suffered, he suffered too. That bond, that fierce loyalty, kept his army following him into the heart of the impossible. In 326 BCE, they faced King Porus at the Battle of the Hydaspes River. The rain fell in sheets, turning the battlefield into a river of mud and blood. Porus, tall and fierce, rode a war elephant adorned with gold armor. His army thundered forward, elephants like living towers, crushing men beneath their feet. Alexander, undaunted, crossed the raging river under cover of night. His strategy was daring, a surprise attack from the flank. The clash was brutal. Arrows whistled through the rain, swords flashed like lightning, and the ground shook beneath the weight of beasts and men. But Alexander's brilliance once again outshone the storm. Porus fought valiantly, refusing to yield even as his army crumbled. When he was finally captured, bleeding and bound, Alexander approached him and asked, "How would you wish to be treated?" Porus, regal even in defeat, replied, "As a king treats another king." Alexander smiled. "So it shall be." He restored Porus' lands and made him an ally, a gesture that revealed not just conquest, but respect. For Alexander believed that true greatness was not only in victory, but in honor. After Hydaspes, his men expected rest. But Alexander's eyes turned east again. He wanted to march further, to the edge of the world. The ocean, he said, was waiting for him. But at the banks of the Hyphasis River, his army stopped. Years of war had broken them. They were far from home, their bodies scarred, their souls weary. The rains poured endlessly, and morale collapsed like crumbling stone. His generals, his soldiers, even his closest friends, pleaded with him to turn back. For the first time, Alexander faced rebellion not from enemies, but from within his own heart of steel. He tried to persuade them to ignite their fire again with words of glory and immortality. But the men would not move. The silence was heavy. They wanted to live, to see their homes again. And Alexander finally understood. He stood before his army, rain falling like tears, and said, "You may return home. I will go on alone." But the soldiers, hardened, loyal, and deeply moved, wept. They begged his forgiveness. They had followed him to the ends of the earth, and now they would follow him home. Their return was grueling. Crossing the Gedrosian desert cost thousands of lives. The heat was unbearable, water scarce, and many perished beneath the sun's cruel gaze. Yet Alexander walked on foot beside his men, refusing even a sip of water unless all could drink. His humanity shone even as his empire stretched thin. When they finally reached Babylon, the city welcomed him as a god returned from beyond the world. But within him, the dream had begun to change. The man who once sought unity now sought divinity. He began adopting Persian customs, demanding that men bow before him. His generals grew uneasy. Whispers spread through the ranks. Had Alexander become what he once destroyed? A tyrant blinded by power? Amid his triumphs, tragedy struck. His closest companion, Hephaestion, fell ill and died. Alexander was inconsolable. He locked himself away, refusing food and sleep. He built a monument for Hephaestion taller than any temple, decreeing him divine. The world had lost a king's friend, but Alexander had lost his soul's mirror. From that day, he was never the same. His eyes no longer burned with the fire of conquest, but with grief. He began to see visions, to hear whispers of destiny fading. The empire he had built, vast and magnificent, began to strain under its own weight. But Alexander pressed on, planning new campaigns, new cities, new dreams. He could not stop. For him, stillness was death. And yet, even as his body weakened, his spirit soared. He had united nations, bridged cultures, and created an empire that transcended borders. His soldiers spoke a dozen languages, but they shared one vision: Alexander's dream of a world without walls. The dream of empire was not merely about power. It was about connection, about blending the wisdom of the East with the strength of the West. And though he would not live to see it flourish, that vision became his greatest conquest. As the sun set over Babylon, Alexander stood on his balcony looking toward the horizon, the same horizon he had chased all his life. His face was older now, his eyes softer. He whispered almost to himself, "There are no more worlds to conquer." And in that silence, perhaps, he finally found peace. The city of Babylon shimmered under the heat of the Mesopotamian sun. Banners fluttered gently from marble towers, and soldiers in bronze armor stood like statues along the palace walls. Within those golden halls, the greatest empire the world had ever seen stretched invisible lines to every horizon, from the deserts of Egypt to the valleys of India. And at its center stood one man, Alexander, king of Macedon, lord of Asia, pharaoh of Egypt, son of Zeus Ammon. But the man who had conquered the world was growing tired. He was only 32, yet his body bore the scars of a lifetime at war. He limped slightly from an old wound. His face was gaunt, his voice softer. The endless campaigns had carved deep trenches into his soul. The boy who had once raced through the fields of Pella, full of dreams and light, was now a god-king weighed down by ghosts. He had lost Hephaestion, his dearest friend, his brother in arms. The grief was unbearable. When Hephaestion died, something within Alexander broke. He refused to eat for days. He wept openly, tore his clothes, and ordered massive funerary rites that consumed whole cities in mourning. He decreed that the flames of the hearth be extinguished throughout the empire, as if the world itself had stopped breathing, and perhaps in a way it had. He began to see omens everywhere: the flight of birds, the sound of thunder, the way the stars moved. All seemed to whisper of fate closing in. He had become obsessed with his own divinity, performing sacrifices daily to ensure the gods still favored him. Yet deep down, he feared they had grown silent. Still, the dream did not die. Alexander planned new campaigns, to march west into Arabia, to explore the ends of the earth, to create a navy that would circle the globe. He wanted to connect every corner of his empire through trade, culture, and shared destiny. Babylon, he declared, would be his capital, the heart of a united world. But destiny had other plans. In the early summer of 323 BCE, a great feast was held in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar, a celebration of victory, remembrance, and ambition. The air was thick with wine and music. Alexander, draped in royal purple, toasted his generals, spoke of new horizons, and laughed like the boy he once was. Then, suddenly, his laughter turned to coughing. He clutched his chest. His voice faltered. A fever took him that night, burning hotter than any battlefield sun. At first, his men thought it was nothing. Alexander had survived worse. He had been stabbed, struck, and poisoned before. But as days passed, the fever only grew stronger. He could no longer speak above a whisper. His body trembled with pain. Still, he demanded to be carried to the temple each morning to make offerings to the gods. He believed, perhaps he knew, that he was facing his final battle. The palace grew quiet. The sound of sandals on marble echoed like thunder. His generals gathered around his bed. Ptolemy, Seleucus, Antipater, Perdiccas, all waiting, hearts heavy with dread. The once unstoppable conqueror lay still, his skin pale, his breath shallow. When his soldiers heard the news, they demanded to see him. One by one, thousands of men, the same warriors who had followed him across continents, filed past his bed. They said nothing. Many wept. Some kissed his hand. Others simply stood in silence, unwilling to believe that their god could die. Alexander could no longer speak, but he raised his head slightly and looked into their eyes, and with one faint motion of his hand, he saluted them, a final farewell from the man who had led them to the ends of the earth. A few days later, the fever consumed him. He drifted in and out of consciousness. When asked who should inherit his empire, he is said to have whispered, "To the strongest." And with that, the conqueror of the world closed his eyes. The world stood still. For 2 days, the body of Alexander the Great lay unburied in Babylon. The air grew thick with incense and mourning. Soldiers refused to eat. Priests chanted in low voices, praying for the safe passage of a god. The man who had united half the known world was gone, and in his absence, the empire he built began to crack. His generals, the diadochi as history would call them, began to quarrel almost immediately. Each believed he had the right to rule. Alexander had left no heir old enough to take the throne, only his unborn son by Roxana and his half-brother, Aridaeus, who was mentally unfit to lead. The unity Alexander dreamed of shattered into pieces. Wars erupted across his vast lands. His generals carved the empire like vultures dividing a feast. Ptolemy took Egypt, founding a dynasty that would rule for centuries, ending with the famous Cleopatra. Seleucus claimed Persia and Mesopotamia, creating the Seleucid Empire. Lysimachus took Thrace and Asia Minor. Antigonus and his descendants fought for Macedon and Greece. The great empire of Alexander the Great dissolved into fragments, yet his influence never faded. His name, his vision, his dream of unity lived on in every city he founded, in every culture he touched. Across the known world, Greek language and culture blended with the East, creating what historians now call the Hellenistic Age. Art, science, philosophy, and architecture flourished. Alexandria in Egypt became a lighthouse of learning, home to the greatest library in history. His generals' descendants ruled kingdoms that carried Greek thought to lands that had never known it before. Even centuries later, emperors, kings, and conquerors would whisper his name as inspiration. Julius Caesar wept at the statue of Alexander, lamenting that he had achieved so little by the same age. Napoleon carried his image into battle, calling him the greatest of all strategists. The modern world, its roads, its cities, its very idea of empire, still echoes with Alexander's footsteps. But behind the legend, there remains the man, a boy who sought greatness not for greed, but for meaning. He once said, "I would rather live a short life of glory than a long one of obscurity." And he did. His life burned like a comet, brilliant, fierce, and brief. Alexander's tomb became a mystery. His body, preserved in honey and gold, was carried to Egypt, where Ptolemy enshrined him in Alexandria. There, people from every corner of the world came to see the man who had conquered time itself. But over the centuries, his tomb vanished, lost to history, perhaps swallowed by the sands he once crossed. Even in death, Alexander remains elusive, forever chasing the horizon. And yet, his true legacy was not his empire, nor his battles, nor the statues carved in his image. It was the idea that humans could reach beyond what seemed possible, that courage, curiosity, and ambition could reshape the world. In uniting nations, he showed that identity was not bound by blood or border. In learning from philosophers, he proved that wisdom could wield as much power as a sword. In embracing other cultures, he reminded the world that greatness lies not in domination, but in understanding. Centuries may pass, but the name Alexander still burns brightly, not just in history books, but in the hearts of dreamers, leaders, and believers who dare to imagine a world without limits. Some say he died too young. Others say he lived too much. But one truth remains. Alexander the Great was not merely a conqueror. He was a mirror of what humanity could become, fearless, flawed, and forever reaching for the stars. As the final rays of the Babylonian sun dipped below the horizon, the winds carried his legend across deserts and oceans, through empires yet unborn. The world he left behind was forever changed. And somewhere, in that eternal twilight between myth and memory, Alexander still rides, armor gleaming, eyes alight with fire, forever chasing one last horizon.